Well, welcome to the Trainers Bullpen. This is where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainers Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainers Bullpen is to advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome back to the show Dr. Michael Kantor. Dr. Michael Kantor has worked as a fitness professional, researcher, and educator for almost a decade and is currently research scientist at Theory X Health and Human Performance Consulting. Dr. Kantor has conducted and published research relating to various aspects of human performance pertaining to the performance of police officers in high-consequence, rapidly unfolding events. Dr. Kantor, welcome back to the Trainers Bullpen.
How's it going, Chris?
Oh, it's going great. It's going great. Thank you. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah.
So, Michael, last time we spoke, we talked about your one of your previous studies that you did on edge weapons attacks and speed with which people could cover grounds before making contact with an officer. And since that episode was published, I just want you to know that episode is one of the most downloaded, most listened to episodes across all of our platforms on the Trainers Bullpen. So your research, my friend, is certainly striking a chord with law enforcement trainers. And I'm excited to talk to you today about your most recent publication that you published in Police Journal, Theory, Practice, and Principles with your co-authors. And the title of this paper for our listeners is Close Quarter Concealed Knife Attacks. How much time do you have? So, Michael, why don't we start with, so you've done actually a few research studies pertaining to human performance and edge weapons attacks. So why this one? Why did you want to do this particular one?
Yeah, so I found that a lot of what we were looking at was either stationary, so within arm's reach, or, from 10, 15, 21, and 30 feet. And I kind of wanted to look at, in a real life, not everything is going to come from those standard distances, and I wanted to look at something that was just outside of arm's reach, but not necessarily the 10, 15 feet that we've covered in the past. So that's kind of where we wanted to kind of get out, like a couple steps away. How long would a knife attack take for if a general population was looking at it? So that was the real inspiration, to just provide more data on more distances. And in our case with this study, it was specifically looking at different knife motions.
So I know as part of your research in doing this study, you looked at LEOCA, law enforcement officers killed and assaulted studies. Is there, and I know they do a very good job of capturing the distances of attacks with, like when subjects attack officers with firearms, with handguns. And we know in those types of attacks, the distance is typically like 10 feet or less, and a bulk of them is at contact or near contact range. You're looking at 5 feet or less. Did you see the same thing with edge weapons attacks, or do we know the frequency with which these distances are beginning at when the attack occurs?
No, not really, because it's outside of very specific scenarios where there's body cam footage to kind of look at where these attacks are coming from. There's no research that really focused on a retrospective analysis of distances of knife attacks. A lot of the retrospective analysis for knife assaults are typically wound location, wound severity, maybe the type of weapon that was used, but no true analysis of distance. So a lot of what this study was, it was really trying to recreate as best as possible of what a scenario would be like in the real world, so to speak. But there was nothing for us to quote unquote reference as this is what has been done in terms of knife assaults, looking at previous assaults that were done in real life and then taking that information. We kind of had to just kind of use what we've used in the past with a lot of the studies that we talked about last time and other studies that I was involved with as kind of the guiding light as to what are we going to do next to really just provide more well-rounded information for tactical operators.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting because, I mean, just intuitively, I think as a trainer, and most trainers would probably affirm this, that when you look at known incidents of attacks where officers have been stabbed, a lot of those occur at near contact range. In fact, I think a lot of them occur, I mean, statistically, we often say the most dangerous time for a police officer is the time of first physical contact by the officer on the subject. And we see so many videos, body cam videos and that, of when the knife comes out. That's really often the distance, isn't it? It's that very close proximity. And just as I was preparing for this talk with you, I pulled up, it doesn't take long to get hits back on Google of these types of incidents. And this one, very recent in Oregon, 2 police officers stabbed by a subject, and it was a call that was simply just a disorderly conduct call. And I think that's the other thing too, that in so many of these cases is it doesn't come in as a person with a knife call. It comes in as a suspicious person, disorderly conduct, disturbance, that type of thing. And then the officers are in close proximity making contact. And that's what happened in this Oregon case, attempting to arrest the individual when the knife came out, and 2 officers were very quickly stabbed before being able to shoot and stop the threat. So I think this is a really important study that you did, and I'm excited to get into it because this is under the bell curve. I think this is the bulk of the type of distances where officers are being attacked with edge weapons.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's hard, when you see the videos, the body cam footage that, very seldomly you get to see a boatload of them. There's usually just 1 or 2 that kind of pop up. It's really hard to really gauge, the distance that they are away from the officer, let alone, if they're, coming up to somebody next to a vehicle or a house call and they open the door, and depending on it's just very difficult to measure that, to actually do a retrospective analysis of like how far are a lot of the common shared knife attacks happening. And that's why 8 feet, that's a good couple steps away from an individual. You're not necessarily always going to see somebody that is going to be standing a foot or 2 away from somebody. Typically, there's going to be some distance between the officer and the individual that they are approaching. So I think that distance, that 8 feet, even up to 10 feet, that's a really good representation of kind of the scenario that the officer is really going to place themselves in more times than not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Just by the virtue of the type of business the officers have to conduct, that's often the proximity to the subject. So you looked at, or in your paper here, you gave a fair bit of ink just as background, talking about Dennis Tueller and the 21-foot rule. And I know we spoke a little bit about that in our last podcast, but just for our listeners again, can you just refresh us a bit, Michael, on the Tueller, Dennis Tueller, and the Tueller principle, 21-foot principle?
Yeah, so essentially what Dennis did was he wanted to kind of figure out best tactics to defend against knife attacks. And he first wanted to figure out how fast an average officer could draw their weapon and discharge 2 shots. He just looked at the officers in his department. He said, hey, do this as fast as you can. And he found that average draw speed to be around 1.5 seconds. And then from there, he said, well, how far can somebody cover in that distance? And after a bunch of tests, he essentially just had his own officers, again, run as fast as they can. At, not necessarily even at somebody, but just over a distance. And what he found was, for the average person running, they can cover 21 feet in 1.5 seconds. Now, that really doesn't give really any space for error, with these officers being the average officer that he found could draw their weapon in 1.5 seconds, and then the average healthy male can actually cover the distance in this 1.5 seconds. He further discussed, if you get to a point where you cannot draw your weapon, that's kind of quoted the danger zone, and then you have to employ other techniques to increase the amount of time you have, whether it's doing a back pedal, a side step, or frankly just increasing the amount of speed you can do in your firearm draw, so getting faster at your draw stroke. So that essentially was the 21-foot principle, and it came out in the 80s, and it's really been a foundational concept that officers have looked at, and myself and others have really analyzed the efficacy of that, but also expanded on distances, population, success rates, movement, to really help paint a better picture as the image, or as the title of this paper, how much time do you actually have? So that was really the inspiration for a lot of what I did, and specifically with this study.
Okay, and so Tuller, that came up with this idea that it took a subject could cover approximately 21 feet in the time that it would take an officer to draw from their holster and fire 2 rounds. And then you and others have done subsequent research. So did your subsequent research confirm the 21-foot rule? Did it add to our understanding of that? Did it change that number? Or what did we end up with?
Yeah, so in the previous study that we looked at, we found that 95% of officers can successfully discharge their weapon twice from 21 feet. So 95%, that's a really good percentage. But we found if you wanted a 100% success rate, 30 feet was the highest percentage. It was 100% regardless of the tactical maneuver used. 30 feet was the best, and that was just looking at a wide range of skill level and years on the force officers, and it gave us a good indication that 100% of our we had officers that just started their first year, and some that were there for 20 plus years, and we found that 30 feet was the magic number for 100% success rate. And then 95%, which is really not that big of a drop, for 9 feet closer at 21 feet. And then it really started to drop when we got into 15 and 10 feet for that study, as low as 15% when we're looking at 10 feet, and a little bit higher at 15 feet. So it drops dramatically when you get 5 feet closer than 21 feet and 5 feet closer at 10 feet. So that's what kind of inspired us to say, let's go a little bit closer now, because again, as we are circling back, that's more real for what these officers are going to deal with, and we need that data to really explain those dynamics.
Right, and I think it's important to mention that all of these studies, and this is not a fault of the studies, but all of these studies have not included the ambiguity, the requirement for perception, for sense making, and then decision making. It's basically just, we're looking at just time frames. How long does it take officers to do this? How long does it take people to cover distance? Are you aware, Michael, of any studies that have put officers into unexpected situations and they've had to actually understand what's happening and then make a decision and then draw their weapon?
Yeah, so we did a study. It was looking at it, basically role playing a domestic call, and we looked at really when they were thrusted upon. Basically, a person walked in from the side of the room, really about 20, 25 feet away, and they couldn't see them, but they could hear them. And then the individual basically presented themselves 20-ish feet away, and then just drew a firearm, and then we examined the startle response. So most people, if you ever get scared, your body does weird things. And this was the really only study that we've done where we were actually able to see and record these random motions that people did. And interestingly enough, it really didn't matter how experienced they were. We had people that, were a couple years on the force and 20 some odd years on the force. And sometimes we had someone that was fairly new and they didn't have much of a startle response. And then we had individuals that were on for 20 years and they demonstrated a huge startle response. Now, there is some debate, and I think you could make a good valid point that someone that has a startle response, sometimes it works in their favor. It gets their body in a ready position for them to respond, but other times it works against them. Many times, if it is like we had a couple people jump in the air, that's not really advantageous for returning fire. We had other individuals put up their opposite hand as kind of a defensive maneuver, even though, a firearm, you're not going to block it with your hand, but it's just a natural response. Mm-hmm. And that may help because during what we saw was, while they were doing that, they were actually going for their firearm. So there is some of that findings that we saw is sometimes the startle response was actually getting the officer in position, but other times it wasn't. But what we saw for the most part is when they are put in a scenario where they're having to respond super, super quick to a spontaneous attack, it's really not possible in what we found for them to avoid at least taking fire first. Now, if they are able to, again, we didn't obviously use we didn't measure accuracy of the individual shooting, and we didn't measure the return fire accuracy. So it's no way to really know if the shots fired on the officer were successful, and there's no way for us to know if the shots returned on the individual that was shooting at them were successful. So that's kind of the challenge in these laboratory-based settings, is we can really get certain aspects, but we can't get it all. But really, in turn, is on a spontaneous firearm attack, you better hope that you're able to avoid getting shot in order for you to return fire. And that was just what we saw on a consistent basis with that study, is there's just not enough time for you to respond to somebody who's already returning or who's already shooting at you, which, it makes sense. So when we put ourselves in a knife situation, there's a little bit more leeway because you do have some time to respond to a charging individual. But for the study of conversation today, we didn't have an actual individual. We just actually used an upright dummy to look at contact time.
Okay, so let's look at this study that you did, your close quarter concealed knife attacks. You broke it down. You said assaults with knives can be delivered in 3 principal modes of delivery: stab, slash, or stab and slash. So how did you identify those 3 modes? What did you do to kind of distill those 3 categories of type of edge weapons attacks?
Yeah, so a lot of it was looking at the retrospective injury analysis of these knife assaults. And a lot of the descriptives of these assaults in the paper talked about it's a stab, it's a slash, or a combination of the two, and usually that's multiple strikes if it's a stab and slash, whereas when you're looking at a stab or a slash, it's usually a singular strike on an individual, or if you can get multiple stabs or multiple slashes. But in addition to that, when we looked at a previous study that we did looking at stationary attacks, we were informed by some experts in the field. Generally, these are the most common style of knife attacks. And even in the paper, I reference one individual, Emerson, I believe, who really spent a lot of, in his paper, really discussing the three different types and how really all of the potential knife attacks can really fall into those three buckets.
Okay, and I often think of, we hear people will say, "Oh, I've been stabbed," and I think often when they say that, they just mean the edge weapon cut them, like I've been stabbed. But this you're talking about, so a stab would that be like a thrust then, a straight thrust, or an overhand ice pick, or is there subcategories of stabs?
So generally when we're thinking about a stab, it's when the tip of the knife is what enters the tissue, whereas a slash is any part of the knife drawing across in some way, shape, or form the tissue. It could be diagonal, it could be horizontal, it could be vertical, and it's drawing across. So when we're thinking about a nail, if you ever hit your hand on a nail, that's kind of a stab. If you've ever got a paper cut, that's kind of a slash. And then the combination of the two, say if someone stabs somebody and while they're in contact with that individual, they then move the knife, say in a horizontal or lateral vertical way.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. And you mentioned a paper that from 2017 saying that stabbing is reported to result in 70% of the law enforcement officers' deaths reported in the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund, making the stab the most lethal method of knife attack. And I'm just assuming that common sense would say that that's because the penetration depth on a stab attack is you're getting into those critical blood-bearing tissues. And is that what would make them more lethal?
Correct. Yeah. I looked at a couple, and even in the paper, I referenced some biomechanical and force generating studies looking at a slash attack and a stab attack. And stab attacks have way higher levels of force production. And then when you coincide that with the Memorial Fund, and their role is just to report what happens. They're not analyzing, they're just reporting. And like you said, if you're able to produce a higher level of force, you're really able to get to those vital organs to really cause a lot of damage and ultimately a higher rate of death.
Okay, so we have that, and then you also write here, you said that officer response time can take anywhere between, it's basically 0.5 and 0.8 to initiate a physical response. So does that mean, that's obviously not then like the conclusion of some response to an edge weapons attack, is that just the initiation, the beginning of some reaction? That's how long it takes, 0.5 to 0.8?
Yep. So after a recognition of, say, a threat, how long does it take an individual to actually initiate the action or a defensive maneuver? And that's where that time comes into play.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so why don't you walk us through your methodology, staying away from the formulas and everything else that I know that researchers use, but how did you do the study? How did you set it up? Who were your participants? And give us a picture of what that looks like.
Yeah, so we recruited about, I believe, 74 subjects ranging in age from 19 to 64 years old. We had individuals that were super fit. We had individuals that were overweight and obese. So we had a really male and female. And so we had these individuals come in, and we had a couple of different factors that we got. We got a bunch of demographic information, height, weight, things like that, estimated aerobic fitness. And then we also did, at the end of the study, we did a push-up assessment just to kind of get a general fitness metric of individuals. And then for the actual knife scenarios, we had, and there's a nice picture in the paper, and I'll kind of walk you through what that image looked like. Is we had essentially 10 cones that were all a foot apart, and on one end was an upright dummy, fully clothed, pants, shirt, standing about 5'8", 5'6" in terms of height, and then the individuals were standing on the other side in a way that the camera was able to capture their dominant arm that they were using. So we had left and right-handed individuals. So there are two pictures in the paper that demonstrates how we just flipped the side that the dummy was on, so the individual ran the other direction so we could capture the other arm. But as you can imagine, all these individuals were not experienced knife fighters. We took a metric, and only about 2 or 3 people had any experience with knives. Primarily it was long sword. It wasn't necessarily directly related to these motions that we were doing. So what we did was we had them watch just a demonstration video of how to conduct each knife attack. I was there to offer small verbal cues just to make sure that they did it right. We had them practice a little bit just on air, and then we had each of them run as fast as they can and deliver a strike. But before they actually delivered the strike, I asked all of them to conceal the knife on your body wherever you want. You just can't hold it. We gave everyone just an elastic waistband to have on them. They didn't have to use it, but we just standardized it that this is what everyone's going to wear. And then we reported where they put the knife. We reported how quick or what distance did the knife become visible. And then we recorded how long the knife took, along with the attack location and type. So whether it's a stab, slash, or whether the attack was on the neck, the chest, the abdomen, things like that. So after we completed all of our subjects, then we were able to look at differences between the knife attacks, which was a thrust, just an underhand stab. Then we had an overhand stab, which is an ice pick. And then we had a horizontal slash, which, think about it, if you put your hand down in front of you and you're drawing it across your body in front of you, imagine if there's a target in front of you, that was the slash attack. And contact was when attack time was completed. It wasn't the completion of the attack. That's really most important for the slashing movement, where we didn't actually measure the completion of the slash. We measured the initial contact, just to be consistent in our methodologies and our time to report. And then to measure attack time, we just use a high-speed camera. And it was really, really helpful. Not only were we able to see it, but then we were able to go frame by frame to really make sure we were exact. So then we ran various different statistical analyses just to say, hey, is there any difference between the males and females that we found? We also separated the group up by young and old, basically 35 and younger, and then 36 and older. We found in the literature that's usually where human performance factors like strength, endurance, aerobic fitness tends to start really dropping off. And then we used those kind of demographic factors to kind of see, is there any indication or anything additional on top of the fact that they're male or female or young and old to maybe indicate someone's faster or slower?
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of repaint this picture so I have it clear in my own mind, Dr. Kantor. So they're about 8 feet away. You've got a dummy with some clothes on it. The participants would stand 8 feet away and they self-initiate their movement, so they would conceal the knife however they wanted on their person. And you'll talk about that, I'm sure, but I'm imagining it was front waistband, back waistband, on the hip or something like that, or in a pocket. Would they self-initiate the movement? Is that what started the timer? They would just start running as quick as they could, and then you stopped it when they made contact.
Yes. So I told each of them that I'm going to be starting the camera. You're going to hear a beep, but that does not mean that you have to react to the beep. It is just starting the camera, and then you initiate the movement whenever you're ready. Because we didn't want the subjects to think that we're testing their reaction time to the beep. We just wanted them to initiate the movement when they were ready.
I think I lost you there for a second, but we're back. You froze up, but
okay. I'll re-say just what I said in terms of the initiation of the movement was specifically on the individuals. We started the timer. It beeped. That's just indicating that it's recording, and then they moved whenever they were ready. Sometimes it was 2 seconds after, sometimes it was 10 seconds after. It was whenever they were ready. And then for the waistband, and we'll get into the results. Most people use them, but not everyone used the waistband. Some people put it in their sock. Some people put it in their pocket. I had an individual put it behind their shirt in the back. They had like a tight shirt on and they put it right there. So majority of it was pretty consistent in terms of the waistband, but we had some specifically the pockets that people use, whether it was the side pocket or the back pocket.
Okay, all right. So why don't you tell us about what you found? What were the results?
Yeah, so from a 10,000 foot view, when we're just thinking about, when I think about a knife attack in terms of the most important information is what is the fastest somebody did it. So we had both a young male and a young a young male and an old male both initiated and completed the thrust attack in just over 1 second. I believe it was like 1.04 seconds. And then for the slowest time that we found, it was 2.5 to 2.75 seconds to complete an 8-foot attack, and both of those were in an older female. So when we're thinking about the range of our sample, again, we had 74 subjects. The fastest attacks were done in just over a second. And again, that is initiating the movement, drawing the knife, and then the initial knife contact. And then when we're thinking about the slowest times, it was over double when we're looking at just a different population, older population, and those that we were female and old. And then, in our paper, we have a nice table that kind of goes over the total sample, male, female, and then we also have like young and old for males and females. And what we found was as a sample, the average attack time was about 1.4 seconds. So when we're thinking about the 21-foot principle going all the way back to that, again, that was just individuals running at a distance of running a distance, and they covered 21 feet in the 1.5 seconds. And in our sample, we found, again, this is more of a general population ranging in fitness level. It took them about 1.4 seconds to complete an 8-foot concealed knife attack. So that's pretty eye-opening in the fact that, the 21-foot principle isn't necessarily the best representation of a knife attack, being there's other factors that come into play in our scenario, with the retrieval of the knife and the execution of the knife attack itself. And then when we broke it down by sex, we found that males, for all of the motions, so the thrust, the ice pick, and the horizontal slash, were all significantly faster than females. So when we're just looking at sex as an indicator of lethality, males were significantly more lethal in terms of their attack time compared to females. So we're looking at roughly about 0.2 of a second faster on all of the movements. And when we're thinking about general reaction time, so for instance, it usually takes about 0.15 seconds for you to visually respond to a cue, and then as we talked about earlier, is that 0.5, 0.8 to actually initiate a movement. So that 0.2 seconds is really significant when we're thinking about motor response, because that time is extra for our body to respond to, not just when we're thinking about overall reaction time, but in the motor response of our ability to actually recognize an attack's happening. To kind of continue on, Chris, do you have any questions based off that before I keep digging?
No, I want you to keep digging, but I just want to clarify this because I think some people may have some confusion around, because they'll think of Dennis Tuller's study and the other study that you and your colleague subsequently did around 21 feet, 30 feet is how far somebody can run in the time it takes an officer to draw and fire. And now you're looking here, that same time pretty much is around at 8 feet, but the difference between these two studies is this one is with a concealed knife that they have to access, they have to deploy and actually make contact with that concealed knife. So this is a whole new context that has never been examined before. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There was a previous study that kind of looked at different weapons from a stationary position with a concealment nature, and I referenced that in the paper, and they reported on kind of the amount of time it took, as extreme as reaching for a pen and using that to stab, but specifically two knives. This is really it's the consideration of the concealment nature and having to get it out. So really going from a non-threat to a threat. That is really the big difference, because when the other studies that we've done and the 21-foot principle, it really assumed and it didn't consider concealment of the knife. We did a study where the person that ran held the knife, so it was very clear that they were already a threat. And our act of concealment is really the factor that increased that time. And I think that's really, really critical, because the act of concealment changes somebody from a non-threat to a threat when they have it. So that's a huge difference in de-escalation if someone is standing there in front of you with a knife compared to someone standing there. Maybe they're just standing and they have their hands they're visible, and then they flip the switch and they start charging, they reach for the knife, and then they deliver that attack. So that's very, very critical. And I really wanted to analyze that, because I think that is a better representation of these spontaneous attacks.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that clarification. Okay. Now you can continue on with your.
Yeah. So when we looked at the differences primarily across all of our group comparisons, male, female, young male versus young female, what we found was, generally speaking, the thrust was the fastest attack that was done. It was the fastest attack for all the groups in our study, and it was significantly faster than usually the other the other knife motions that we found. Usually it was faster than the horizontal slash, but sometimes it was also faster than the overhead. But across the board in all of our groups, the thrust attack was the fastest. And biomechanically speaking, it makes a lot more sense, because there's a picture in the paper, but I can kind of walk you through it. It's, imagine, you're walking, and where your hands are when you're walking, if you bend your elbows, and then just basically extending out in front of you, that is the thrust. So when we think about an individual running, the motion of running and then the delivering of a thrust, it's very close to the movement of the run, so it's very quick to deliver. Whereas the overhead, sure, an individual can run, but then they have to lift the knife all the way over their head and then drive it down. And then the horizontal slash was, again, a little bit longer because they're running, but then they had to essentially abduct their arm away from their body and then drive it horizontally across their body on the target. And that took a lot of time for our individuals to do. So across the board, the thrust attack was the fastest. And that was demonstrated by the individuals that had the fastest knife attack. In all of our groups, male, female, young female, old female, the thrust was the fastest in all of those groups.
So not only the fastest, also the most lethal.
Yes. Correct.
And
yeah, because not only that, because another thing that hasn't really been looked at is how much extra force is actually being generated by the momentum of someone running. Because I can tell you, majority of our individuals, when they were running, that momentum from the stab, they carried past the target. And I actually specifically told them that, I want you to attack as fast as you can, and just so you know, you can run past the target if you want, or you can stand there and do it. It doesn't matter. Do whatever you want, but just don't knock over the target, because it was upright. It was actually on a 2-wheel dolly, so it was just an injury thing. We had to let them know that we don't want you to tackle it. So we had majority of our individuals essentially just running through off to the side from the target, but we did have a couple, and primarily it was individuals that were executing like the overhead stab or the horizontal attack, where they actually gathered themselves a little bit to execute it, which makes sense, because if they run really fast and then they have to execute the overhead, they're lifting it up and driving it down. They can't really do that. Well, some couldn't do that while they were running.
Okay, and as you did this, at what point, was there a point, Michael, at which the knife came out? So I'm trying to picture this in my head. They start with the knife concealed, they start running, and at what point in that 8-foot approach to the target did the knife begin to come out, or was it dependent upon the concealment method when the knife came out?
Yeah, good question. So we didn't actually analyze it, but we reported it in the paper just as descriptive statistics to really paint a picture of the average difference distance. And what we found, between 5 to 6 feet. So really within the first step forward, the knife was starting to be visible. However, right in the beginning of our results, we really talk about the closest the knife became visible. So we had individuals that simply ran essentially almost all the way to the target before they actually retrieved their knife. So anywhere from 2 to 3 feet away from the target. But as a group, it was between 5 to 6 feet, or really within the first step forward of the attack. We found on average it was within the first step of the charge, so around 5 to 6 feet. So average step is up to a yard. So within the first step, the knife was visible to the camera, which again was facing right on the lateral side of the body to see them starting and the target. So we were able to get a good representation of when the knife became visible. But what we found was some individuals charged first and then went for the knife. And there's a table in our paper that really details it, but generally majority of the individuals within that 5 to 6 feet, that's when the knife was visible. And then in terms of location, basically what I did was I just casually, right before they were starting, I just made a note on my data collection sheet of the location that they concealed it. Was it the left hip? Was it the right hip? Was it the back? Was it the front? Was it the back pocket? Was it the right pocket, left pocket? In addition to that, we had the video to look back after, so I cross-referenced just to make sure that that was correct. And majority of the individuals that we had, it was somewhere on the hip, whether on it, usually it was on the side that they were. So if they're right-handed, a lot of times it was on the right side, but some people that were right-handed put it on the left side, because if you think about running, it's kind of easy just to kind of reach over while someone's running across their body to grab the knife. So we saw a mix of that, but generally speaking was either the right, left, or in the back in terms of the hip. And they used the waistband that we provided. Some people put it in their like pants in the back. Some people had a belt on and just put it in there. But that was generally what we were looking at in terms of where the knife was.
Okay. And did you weren't measuring like where were they actually attacking the target, or did you in this study?
So we did, yep. So we reported general location. Was it the chest? Was it the abdomen? Was it the shoulder? Was it the head? Was it the leg? Majority of the time, almost all of them, and there's a table in the paper that details it all. Generally, it was the chest and abdomen. Mind you, I think this is an important piece, and I actually forgot to talk about this, but it's actually really critical. So the individual or the dummy that we had upright, we had a visible vest on them. It wasn't it was a black padded vest, and what I told each individual was the knife was resistant to edge weapons. This is really common in specifically European countries. They wear vests that are resistant to sharp objects, just how officers in the United States wear the Kevlar with the bulletproof vest. It's very common in the European countries to wear knife-resistant vests. So I told each of them every single time, hey, this individual is wearing a vest that is resistant to knife point edge weapons. And even them knowing that, the most common location was the chest and the abdomen. Well, where do you think the vest was covering? Those two locations. So individuals in the heat of the moment weren't even really there wasn't really a high level of stress. They still were delivering a strike on the target where the highest level of protection was, which I thought was very, very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think even in correctional settings in North America, a lot of correctional officers wear armor that is intended to defeat edge weapons type attacks as well. Yeah. So what's the takeaways from this for trainers and for officers then? So we understand the speeds with which these can happen, Michael, within that 8 feet window. We look at the concealment methods, how fast they can access it, where they're attacking the target on the approach. So what do you feel you'd want trainers to walk away from and go, what are the implications for how we train police officers?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the time first. So attack time for these close quarter attacks being concealed can be as fast as 1.04 seconds, which is extremely fast. And then when we're looking at individual profiles, males are always, and what we found, males are going to be significantly faster than females, regardless of the attack method used. And then when we looked at the demographic factors, we looked at estimated aerobic fitness, we looked at muscular strength, height, weight, all of those things. None of it was a significant factor in these close quarter attacks because, for instance, we had our younger group had a significantly higher estimated aerobic capacity, being basically they were more cardiovascularly fit. But what we found in the analysis with the attack times, it didn't matter. It's too short of a distance for your respiratory fitness to play a role. In addition to that, strength didn't play a role in these close quarter attacks. Again, it's we were looking at strength, not necessarily muscular power. And for those that don't really know the difference between the two, when you max out on bench press one time, you're seeing how much force can you generate. Whereas power is how quickly can you move the weight that you are lifting. And those two are very different in terms of how they translate into human movement. So we looked at muscular strength, and that did not play a role in these attacks. And then the last thing is knowing the time that you have. On average, it was 1.43 seconds, but it could be as fast as 1.04. Worst case scenario, I always prep for the worst and hope for the longest, upwards of 2.5, 2.75 seconds. How or what can you do in that time to respond? When we're thinking about average reaction time, 0.15 for you to just recognize it with your eyes, but then upwards of 0.8 seconds for you to actually initiate a movement. So with that, what movement are you going to do? Are you going to, is it the firearm? Are you going to reach for your firearm? Are you going to make a defensive maneuver? And when you think about that in terms of just time, it really narrows in what an individual can do. And I'm not here to essentially tell you what you can do, because I think depending on the officer's experience, skill level, it could be different. Maybe an officer feels really, really confident in their ability to respond with just a lateral movement and going for their firearm. Maybe others feel where with this close contact, it's hand on knife. Maybe that's the best that the individual can do. But one thing that probably isn't going to work is trying to turn and run away to get a defensive position, because it's just not enough time. If you try to turn and run, by that moment of you taking your first turning step to the outside, contact is already made. So it really puts officers in a bind to really respond in a effective way. And I think that's what's so important about this study, is it really paints a picture as to how challenging these officers are put in, and how quickly it can go from a non-threatful situation to now a really situation where it's almost next to, I don't want to say impossible, but very, very challenging for the officers to respond in an effective defensive manner.
I love those implications. I still hear, law enforcement officers make comments like, well, that you shouldn't take a knife to a gunfight. But I think often that is completely wrong-headed, because, and we look at a study like this, and the reality is that in a lot of these close contact, near contact situations, the first indication an officer is going to have that a knife is involved is the fact they're probably already being stabbed or already being slashed by it. And so now what do you do with that, right? And so I think if we understand that, then the training implications, at least to me, are we need to make sure we create learning environments for officers to be able to experience what you've just outlined in this paper, the speed with which these things, the time compressed nature that they can unfold in, so officers can explore what are more desirable and less desirable solutions to this. But the less desirable one, as you pointed out, Michael, is standing there thinking you're going to draw your gun and deliver effective fire. You're going to be stabbed or slashed 4 or 5 or 6 times in the time it takes you to be able to get even your first shot off.
Exactly. And even if an officer is really, really skilled with their firearm draw, you're really not going to be able to come up to a high ready, fully extended position. You're essentially going to have to shoot from the hip, literally. And at that point, even if you were to get a shot off, is it actually enough to slow the individual down, who probably at that point is within a foot or two of you, and momentum is just going to carry on? And it's just a challenging situation that we examined, and what we found out, and how little time individuals have. And I think time is the biggest factor that we found. Yeah, we looked at a bunch of other things, attack location, the style of attack, but what I think is most important is how much time do you have, which is why it's in the title. Because I think once you know the time, then you can plan and train for the time. Putting yourself in a scenario where you have a heightened stress level and you have to react quickly and you have to facilitate defensive maneuvers rapidly, and you need to have some plan in place if it hits the fan. So again, it's a challenging situation, and really going into the study, we kind of already knew what was going to happen, but it was nice to get data to really support kind of our suspicions, because again, this is building on a study where we looked at 10 feet, 15 feet, 21 feet, 30 feet. We moved closer. We're like, this is only going to get worse in terms of the amount of time an individual is going to have.
Right. Well, you summarized it so well there with the implications for trainers, for officers to experience all of these types of situations in training, so you can learn how much time you do, or probably more accurately, don't have, so you can develop effective responses to all of these challenging circumstances. Dr. Kantor, we've been going for an hour now, sir. I want to thank you so much for your time, but I'll give you the last word. Is there anything that you would like to say, questions you wished I would have asked you, things that you want to conclude this conversation with?
Yeah, probably the biggest thing is training in as close to real world scenarios is going to be the best way for preparation. You have to see how your body responds under stress. You'd be surprised at how negatively impacted your performance is, even though in the moment you felt like you were moving super, super fast. You most likely were moving twice as slow. So putting your body under that stress time and time again to make sure that when it actually occurs, your body knows how to respond. It knows how to cognitively process that this scenario is even happening. Many times officers are probably just like, is this individual really charging at me right now? Is this really happening? And by then it's already too late. So putting your brain in a rhythm to recognize the cue and to respond properly. You may not be able to get down to that 1.04 seconds, but if you can get close to that, that is going to be a really good place to be at.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that. And I know the last time we spoke on your last paper, some of the listeners, the trainers, actually reached out to you because they had questions and they wanted more information. So if our audience, Michael, they want to reach out to you and ask you questions or get more information, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, the best way is just going to be either through LinkedIn, so you can just look up my name, Michael Kantor. That's going to be the easiest way, or they can email me. And I don't know, Chris, maybe you can just put it in the caption for the conversation that it's just michael.kantor@rm.edu. That's a really good way to just contact me if you have more of a long threaded conversation that you want to have or questions. But primarily just find me on LinkedIn and we can have a conversation. So I want to help out as much as I can. And I tried to basically put myself in this paper to basically represent me trying to talk to the officers as best as I possibly could and try to cover as much as possible.
Well, that's great. And thank you for what you do for law enforcement, for public safety. Dr. Kantor, your research and that of your fellow researchers in this paper and the previous ones that you've done, and undoubtedly in the future ones that'll come off your desk as well, you're making a huge difference in helping law enforcement training be at least evidence-informed and really helping to make our officers and the public safer. So thank you for what you do.
Absolutely.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainers Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainers Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.